While enemy soldiers prayed for the storm to end, Ragnar Lothbrok prayed for it to get worse. In 20-foot waves and hurricane winds, he would achieve what calm seas never could, the conquest of the unconquerable. This is the story of how Ragnar turned nature's fury into his greatest weapon and accomplished the impossible naval assault that made enemies believe Vikings could command the very seas themselves. The monastery fortress of Lindisfarne stood on its rocky island like a challenge to the gods themselves. For 300 years, no enemy had set foot on its sacred shores. The deadly storms that surrounded it had claimed over 1,000 ships, creating a graveyard of broken vessels and drowned warriors. English monks called it God's own fortress, protected by divine wrath from the fury of heathens. The treacherous waters around the island were legendary for their violence. Waves that could crush longships like kindling, winds that could snap masts like twigs. The perfect natural defense. What made Lindisfarne unconquerable wasn't its walls or soldiers. It was the supernatural storms that surrounded it. Local fishermen spoke of waves tall as mountains, winds that screamed like banshees, and currents that dragged ships down to feed the sea monsters below. The fortress had never fallen, because no ship could survive the approach. But while other raiders saw impossible obstacles, Ragnar Lothbrok saw opportunity. Where they feared the storm, he saw the perfect cover. Where they saw deadly waves, he saw a weapon that no fortress could defend against. Tonight, as the worst storm in decades raged across the North Sea, Ragnar would prove that sometimes the most impossible conditions create the most impossible victories. While his captains begged him to wait for calmer seas, Ragnar Lothbrok stood on the cliff watching the supernatural storm and seeing what no other Viking had ever imagined. The storm wasn't his enemy. It was his greatest ally. The same hurricane winds that made sailing impossible would also make defending impossible. The same massive waves that threatened to destroy his ships would hide his approach until he was already inside the fortress. Most importantly, the English would never expect attack during such conditions. Their guards would be sheltering from the storm, their defenses unmanned, their vigilance abandoned. Ragnar's plan was as brilliant as it was insane. Use the storm's chaos as perfect camouflage. The screaming winds would mask the sound of his approach. The massive waves would hide his ships from watchtowers. The supernatural violence of the weather would make the English believe attack was impossible. But this required more than courage. It demanded seamanship skills that bordered on the supernatural. His crews would have to navigate by instinct in zero visibility, maintain formation in crushing waves, and time their assault perfectly with the storm's rhythm. One mistake would mean death for every warrior. Success would mean the conquest of the unconquerable. The English feared storms because they saw them as divine punishment. Vikings loved storms because they saw them as divine assistance. This psychological difference would be Ragnar's greatest weapon. While English soldiers huddled in terror, praying for the storm to end, Ragnar's warriors would be energized by the chaos. They understood that Thor's thunder and Odin's wind were fighting alongside them. The storm that paralyzed his enemies would unleash his Vikings. Navigating to Lindisfarne in clear weather required expert seamanship. Doing it in a supernatural storm required something approaching divine guidance. Ragnar would have to sail by pure instinct, reading wave patterns invisible in the darkness, feeling wind changes through the chaos. His navigational skills had been honed by 30 years of raiding in every possible weather condition. He had learned to read the sea's moods like other men read faces, to sense land through storm darkness, to find harbors that didn't want to be found. Tonight, all that experience would be tested against the worst storm in living memory. Only Ragnar's most experienced warriors would survive this assault. He chose men who had sailed through supernatural storms, fought in impossible conditions, and proven they could function when normal men would freeze in terror. These weren't ordinary raiders. They were maritime specialists who lived for the challenge of sailing where other men died. The storm that would kill most Vikings would make these warriors stronger. Each man understood they were attempting something that had never been done. conquering the unconquerable through weather mastery. Ragnar's longships were already the finest vessels in the medieval world, but surviving a supernatural storm required special modifications, extra rigging to handle impossible winds, reinforced hulls to survive crushing waves, and storm anchors to maintain position in chaos. Most importantly, the ships needed to be able to beach in conditions where normal vessels would be smashed to pieces. Ragnar designed special landing techniques that would work even in massive surf, turning the deadly waves into launching ramps for his assault. The ships became weapons designed specifically for weather warfare. For weeks, Ragnar's crews practiced sailing in increasingly dangerous conditions. They learned to work together when they couldn't see their hands, to maintain formation when waves threw them in every direction, to fight seasickness while preparing for battle. Each warrior mastered storm sailing techniques that most sailors never attempted, reading wave patterns in darkness, feeling wind changes through chaos, maintaining balance during impossible ship movements. They transformed from raiders into something new, storm warriors who could fight nature and men simultaneously. Ragnar spent days studying the storm's patterns, learning its rhythms like a musician learning a complex song. He discovered that even supernatural storms had moments of relative calm, brief windows when assault became possible. The key was timing the approach for maximum storm cover while hitting the fortress during a momentary lull that would allow landing. This required predicting the storm's behavior with impossible accuracy. Ragnar's weather reading skills approached the supernatural. He could feel storm changes before they happened, sense wind shifts through the chaos, predict wave patterns in zero visibility. Landing on Lindisfarne in calm weather was challenging. Doing it during a supernatural storm was theoretically impossible. The rocky shores that protected the island would become death traps in massive waves. Ragnar's solution was to use the storm's power as his landing force. Instead of fighting the waves, he would ride them like a weapon, timing his approach so the storm itself threw his ships onto the beach with unstoppable force. This required split-second timing and supernatural seamanship skills. One miscalculation would dash his ships against the rocks. Before launching into the supernatural storm, Ragnar performed the traditional Viking blessing, but with a twist. Instead of asking the gods for calm seas, he asked them to make the storm worse. He prayed to Thor for stronger thunder, to Odin for more violent winds, to Aegir for higher waves. The storm wasn't his enemy, it was his divine ally sent by the gods themselves. His warriors understood. They weren't fighting the storm, they were joining it. As Ragnar's longships pushed off from the beach, they immediately disappeared into the supernatural storm. Waves tall as mountains crashed over the bows, winds screamed like banshees, and visibility dropped to zero. Within minutes, the ships were separated by the chaos, each crew fighting for survival in conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. Lightning illuminated brief glimpses of other vessels struggling through the hurricane before darkness swallowed them again. This was seamanship beyond normal human capability, pure instinct and supernatural skill against nature's maximum fury. Ragnar navigated by feel alone, reading the sea's mood through his ship's movements, sensing Lindisfarne's direction through storm chaos. His compass was useless in the lightning, his landmarks invisible in the darkness. Instead, he used techniques passed down through generations of Viking navigators, feeling land through wave patterns, sensing wind changes that indicated approaching shores, reading the storm's behavior like a living creature. This was navigation as art form. Seamanship elevated to supernatural levels through 30 years of experience in impossible conditions. Waves the size of buildings crashed over the longships, threatening to crush them like kindling. Ragnar's crews used advanced storm sailing techniques, riding wave faces instead of fighting them, using the ship's flexibility to bend with the storm, timing their movements with the sea's rhythm. Each wave was a potential death sentence, each wind gust a threat to snap the mast. Survival required constant vigilance, supernatural reflexes, and seamanship skills that bordered on magic. The storm tested every technique Ragnar had learned in 3 decades of impossible sailing. Maintaining fleet coordination in zero visibility seemed impossible, but Ragnar had developed storm communication techniques using horn calls that cut through wind screams, lightning signals that pierced the darkness, and wave movements that conveyed tactical information. His captains were masters of storm sailing, each capable of independent navigation while maintaining loose formation. They stayed together through shared instinct and supernatural seamanship rather than visual contact. The fleet moved through the hurricane like a pack of sea wolves, coordinated despite the chaos. As they neared Lindisfarne, the storm reached supernatural intensity. The waves became mountains of water, the winds achieved hurricane force, and the lightning turned night into strobing day. But Ragnar could feel the island's presence through the chaos, the subtle change in wave patterns that indicated approaching land, the wind shifts that meant shelter was near, the storm behavior that revealed hidden shores. The Unconquerable fortress was directly ahead, completely undefended because no one believed assault was possible in such conditions. Using the storm's own power as his weapon, Ragnar timed his approach perfectly. As a massive wave built behind his fleet, he rode it like a liquid mountain, letting the storm itself hurl his ships onto Lindisfarne's rocky beach with unstoppable force. The landing was violent beyond description, ships flying through the air on wave crests, crashing onto stone beaches with bone-jarring impact, warriors leaping into surf that should have drowned them instantly. But Ragnar's storm landing techniques worked. The impossible had been achieved. Armed Vikings on Lindisfarne's supposedly unconquerable shores. The English had never conceived that attack was possible during such weather. Their guards were sheltering from the storm, their defenses unmanned, their gates secured against weather rather than warriors. Ragnar's Vikings emerged from the supernatural storm like demons materialized from chaos itself. The monks and soldiers had been praying for the storm to end. Instead, it had delivered their worst nightmare directly to their doors. The fortress that had never fallen because no ship could reach it was now completely defenseless against enemies who had turned impossibility into tactical advantage. The storm that had protected Lindisfarne for centuries now concealed its conquest. Thunder masked the sound of splintering gates. Lightning illuminated brief glimpses of Viking warriors before darkness swallowed them again. Screaming winds covered the screams of defeat. Ragnar's assault was perfectly coordinated despite the chaos. His warriors moved through the fortress like storm spirits, appearing and disappearing in the supernatural weather, conquering room by room, while nature provided perfect camouflage. The English never organized effective resistance because they couldn't see, hear, or coordinate in the storm's fury. Lindisfarne's treasures were legendary. 300 years of accumulated wealth from across Christian Europe, gold and silver offerings, precious manuscripts, religious artifacts worth kingdoms. But the real treasure was psychological. Ragnar had proven that no fortress was unconquerable, no defense was perfect, no natural protection was absolute. The storm conquest of Lindisfarne would terrify enemies across Europe. Wealth was temporary, but reputation was eternal. As quickly as they had appeared, Ragnar's Vikings vanished back into the storm. Loading their ships with treasure while waves crashed around them, they used the same storm seamanship that brought them to carry them safely away. The retreat was as impossible as the approach, launching into supernatural waves, navigating by instinct through hurricane chaos, disappearing into the storm like sea phantoms returning to their element. By dawn, when the storm finally calmed, only smoking ruins would remain to prove the impossible had happened. As the supernatural storm finally exhausted itself, dawn broke over calm seas to reveal the impossible. Lindisfarne's fortress was a smoking ruin, its treasures gone, its defenders scattered. Local fishermen who had hidden from the storm emerged to find evidence of the most impossible naval assault in history. Viking ships had somehow reached the unreachable island during the worst weather in living memory. The conquest that couldn't happen had happened. English lords who heard the news refused to believe it. Lindisfarne had been unconquerable for 300 years. No ship could survive the storm approach. The fortress was protected by God himself. But the evidence was undeniable. Viking weapons scattered on sacred ground, English bodies washed up on storm beaches, the fortress burning despite the rain that should have extinguished any fire. Ragnar had achieved the impossible through weather mastery that seemed supernatural. Ragnar's fleet appeared on the horizon like phantoms emerging from legend. Despite sailing through the worst storm in decades, every ship had survived through superior seamanship and storm mastery techniques. Their sails bore the wind damage of hurricane survival. Their hulls showed the scars of impossible waves. But their crews were intact, and their treasure holds were overflowing with Lindisfarne's sacred wealth. The impossible naval assault had been perfectly executed. News of the storm conquest spread across medieval Europe like wildfire. Ragnar Lothbrok hadn't just conquered a fortress, he had conquered nature itself, turning the sea's fury into his weapon. Coastal fortresses that had felt secure behind natural storm barriers suddenly realized they were vulnerable to a Viking who could sail in any weather. No defense was absolute against a warrior who commanded the very storms. Ragnar's reputation transformed from successful raider to something approaching divine, the storm master who could turn weather into warfare. Even his enemies acknowledged that Ragnar's storm conquest transcended normal human capability. English chronicles called it sorcery. Christian monks declared it impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Ragnar had proven that superior seamanship, combined with tactical genius and supernatural courage, could overcome any natural obstacle. He had rewritten the rules of naval warfare through weather mastery. The Viking who prayed for worse storms had become legend. Ragnar's storm conquest established new principles of naval warfare. Weather as weapon, natural obstacles as tactical opportunities, and impossible conditions as perfect camouflage. Viking captains across Scandinavia studied his storm sailing techniques, trying to replicate the seamanship mastery that made weather warfare possible. The storm conquest of Lindisfarne became the gold standard for impossible naval achievement. In his great hall, Ragnar celebrated surrounded by Lindisfarne as sacred treasures and warriors who had survived the impossible storm assault. They feasted as men who had achieved something beyond normal human capability. The storm that should have killed them had made them wealthy. The weather that should have stopped them had carried them to victory. The impossible conditions had created the perfect conquest. They drank to the storm master and the Vikings who could sail in any weather. Ragnar's storm conquest of Lindisfarne became the defining moment when Vikings proved they could overcome any obstacle through superior skill and supernatural courage. The impossible naval assault created a legend that would echo through centuries. Coastal kingdoms learned to fear not just Viking ships, but Viking weather mastery. No storm was too violent, no conditions too dangerous, no fortress too protected by natural barriers. From the smoking ruins of Lindisfarne, a new truth emerged. For Vikings who mastered the storm, nothing was unconquerable. The sea itself had become their ally, and Ragnar Lothbrok was the storm master who proved that sometimes impossible conditions create impossible victories. In the great hall of Valhalla, even the gods raised their horns to salute a warrior who had turned their own tempests into weapons of conquest. The storm master had earned his place among the immortal legends of the sea.